Welcome. My name is Reyes Gonzalez, and I have the privilege of being the president of St. Augustine College. Thank you for joining us today in our lecture series, Transforming Latino Lives Through Knowledge. Today, we have a very special guest. She's going to share with us her life experience, her journey into becoming the leader that she is. She brings a very special perspective on what it means to be a first time or a first graduate and the struggles that she went through life and everything that she had to do. She brings also the life history of everything that she has done for Latinos. She has spent the majority of her life advocating for Latinos, for their rights as well as for equity, so that we can receive what we're entitled to, so that we can be successful. We have none other than Michelle Morales with us. She's an icon in our community, as well as the president for Woods Fund in Chicago. So, Michelle, welcome to St. Augustine College, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored that you all asked me to be part of the lecture series. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your 40th anniversary.
Oh, thank you very much. And we have a number of questions that we would like to ask about your life. And I'm sure that our audience also have questions. I would like to save a few minutes at the end so that we can give our audience an opportunity to ask the questions that they have. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about how was it that you became the leader that you are in our community?
Oh, that's a long story. So I'm, in addition to being a first generation college graduate, I'm a first generation US-born Puerto Rican. My parents migrated to Puerto Rico in the 1950s and 1960s, and then I was born in New York in 1975, 45 years ago. And so much of my, I think, leadership development was very much crafted by my experiences as a first generation US-born Puerto Rican woman, watching, like I think many Latinos who attend St. Augustine and who are on the call today, the struggles that our parents had, watching how they navigated life in the United States, and then watching how, to be honest, how often we were treated as Puerto Ricans, right, living in the United States. My father was in the military, so we moved around on military bases and often lived in communities, and I went to schools that were predominantly white, where we were, if not the only, one of the few Latinos, and definitely the only Puerto Ricans, you know, in the school. And so that definitely, I think, gave me a lens early on around racial equity, around dignity, rights, human rights, that has kind of really defined my career trajectory and my leadership development.
That is all very interesting to us because one of our goals is to help Latinos to transform their lives through education so that we can empower our students so that, and also so that they can participate in a democracy and not only advocate, but also demand our rights in our society and in our country.
Right.
To me, it's very interesting, your whole trajectory. Can you speak a little bit about what was it to, what were your experience? Did you see yourself as a first generation student when you were in college? Tell me about your experience and how was it like? I'm sure that many of our students are going through something similar, but certainly you had a very unique life.
Yeah, so so we were stationed in Indianapolis, Indiana, when I was in high school. I'll give a little bit of a background. In my high school at that time of 3,000 students, I think I was one of three, literally one of three Latino students at that school. So the experience and the reality of Latino and Puerto Rican students was not something that the school really recognized or talked about. My father was in the military, as I mentioned. I am the only person in my family, so not only my parents did not go to college, but I'm the oldest of three, and my younger brother and sister did not attend college either. And so I think like many students who attend St. Augustine, you go through that process by yourself, right? I was actually very fortunate. I'm one of these students that I was a nerd early on. I loved school. I loved learning. So definitely, I think had in some ways an easier experience in school because I was so eager to learn, and the teachers would pick up on that. But even with that, and even with having straight A's, I was still told that I should not attend college, that I would
Mm,
not be able to succeed in college, that I should consider a trade school or some sort of trade. So this was in 1992, 1993. And I was determined to go to college only because I, one, knew that no one in my family had attended college. And at that time, I think that the social contract with obtaining a college degree was still intact. I think we've seen it
mhm,
kind of fall apart a little bit in the last couple of years. And I knew that if I wanted a certain quality of life and a type of life, that I should get a college degree.
mhm,
And so really kind of went on the journey by myself. My parents were not big advocates of me attending college. They did not want me to move away from home. I did not receive much help from my high school counselor. Filled out applications on my own, filled out the financial aid on my own, and then got accepted to DePaul University here in Chicago. And so that's where I attended my undergrad. And it was a culture shock.
mhm,
Moving away from home, coming to a private university, a private Catholic university in the middle of the city, that is a type of university that attracts students of wealth,
mhm,
was shocking to me.
mhm,
It was the first time I was around students or other people who came from wealth, whose parents were able to write, pay for tuition by writing a check. Students who were talking about books that they read and discussions they had in high school. I remember this very vividly my freshman year that I had never experienced in my public high school. And so definitely felt inadequate, felt like I didn't belong, felt like I didn't have the skill sets to succeed, worried about money all of the time. And it was very difficult, I think, to particularly my freshman year to find that community of students that had, that where we all shared the same experience. So freshman year
mhm.
was pretty difficult for me. I actually contemplated dropping out and going back home because it was at many points just really rough. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, Michelle, it's very moving. So, what advice would you have for students that are uh, being told that they should not pursue a college education, or that perhaps college is not for them, that they should pursue
Mhm.
something else? What would advice would you give our many Latinos that may hear those sort of advice, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I still think it's interesting. I think that we've kind of swung the other way now as a society where we are pushing, if you will, college on students, even if it may not be the right choice for them. But if there is a student that believes deep down the way I did that college is for them and that they want to attend college, the hard part and where I think it becomes very disappointing is that high school teachers and high school counselors are authority figures, right? And if
Hmm.
you tell a young person that college may not be for you, you should consider another option, that can be detrimental, right? Because
Hmm.
we're trained, I think, particularly in the Latino community, we
Hmm.
are raised to listen to our authority figures, and we are raised
Yes.
kind of to listen to teachers and things of that nature. And so we could fall into a trap of believing that, right? And so I think it takes a very unique student who has the will and the ability to advocate for themselves to push through and still go to college, which is why I think we see so many students not attending college because
Hmm.
they're told one thing and then they believe it, and then may not be true. So I think, unfortunately, right, like how can students develop the skill sets to be able to advocate for themselves so that they're aware of what they want and they're aware of what, at the very least, they want to try, and to be able to go ahead and do that, regardless of sort of the advice that they may be getting from adult figures in their life.
Yeah. You bring up a very interesting point, another interesting point, and that is that certainly college should be accessible and available to everyone, but perhaps
Absolutely.
college comes at a different point in our life. We often speak that education is not linear. There's
Right.
some of us that life happens
Hmm.
and it takes a turn and it takes us in a different
Hmm.
direction, and then it brings us back to education. But
Yeah.
certainly, college, we believe that college should be accessible, and it sounds that is also something that you promote.
Yes. Yeah, and I believe, it's I think why institutions like St. Augustine are so important in our
Mhm.
community, because you all provide sort of that atmosphere and that flexibility for people to come at any stage in life to study.
Mhm.
I think we're still very much a society that believes that you have to start college when you're 18 or 19, that you can't
Mhm.
come back when you're older. And we're still very much a society that does not believe that you should try other things first.
Mhm.
So I'm a mother. I have a
Mhm.
16-year-old and I have a 23-year-old stepson, and we pushed our 23-year-old into college, and
Mhm.
it did not actually turn out well.
Yeah.
Right? We should have let him experiment. We should have let him try to figure things out. He was fortunate, unlike my experience, where I had to figure out college and I had to figure out working almost immediately after high school. We provided a safety net for him so he could have experimented. He ended up dropping out his freshman year because emotionally and mentally he was not ready for college,
Mhm.
and instead went a different path. And so now with our 16-year-old, we're actually taking a different approach with him, and he's very interested in culinary arts. We're exploring that with him and exploring culinary schools with the narrative that you could always go back to college when you decide to. And I think
Yes.
that that's still something, right, that we're not hearing in the larger discourse, if you will, when it
Mhm.
comes to higher education.
Yes, and at Sam Augustine College, we are experiencing that
Hmm.
this matter that you just mentioned, and that is the majority of our students are in their 30s, and they're
Hmm.
first coming
Yeah,
into our average
yeah,
age is around 32, 33 years old. So
yeah,
that means
exactly.
that our students are, in about approximately 87% of all of our students are Latinos, and we pride
Hmm.
ourselves in making education affordable and accessible to Latinos. Um,
Exactly.
and we pride ourselves that at our institution, we're an institution of inclusivity. We welcome everybody, but our mission speaks
Hmm.
about being here for Latinos. And that's what we try to do, provide the quality education that's affordable and accessible. And we're also very pleased that a good portion of our students are women. And that
Yeah,
brings a lot of joy to me because of the importance that I see certainly in providing quality education to Latino women.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
And that and I wish that there were more institutions like St. Augustine and like the city colleges of Chicago, right? That is another institution, right, where
mhm,
students can come back when they're older, and they very much, like St. Augustine, you cater your services to,
mhm,
Latinx or to students of color. And I just
mhm.
wish that that was more prevalent, right, throughout the United States.
Yeah. And the other thing that we're finding out and that we're striving to do is what we often refer to as breaking the cycle of poverty,
Yep.
and in trying to provide the type of education so that our students can get into high-paying jobs as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
Which
Hmm.
kind of leads me also to something that I know that is very dear to you, and that's into racial equity.
Yes.
So can you
Hmm.
tell me a little bit about your views on lecture racial equity, and also how that plays into how higher education, and those of us that are in education, what can we do to break that gap?
Yeah. So we at the foundation, and I think in much of the work I've done throughout my career, has focused on how to promote and how to push racial equity so that we are always working towards undoing, right, systemic and institutional racism,
Mhm.
which has largely contributed to the economic disparities that we see, and often the inability of communities of color, particularly Black and Latino communities, to be able to achieve that economic wealth, right, and to close that wealth gap. We know that there are systems in place that purposefully bar us from gaining that wealth, right? There was a huge report, or I'm sorry, huge article that came out, I think it was over the summer, that showed that Chase Bank, right, uh, uh, lent mortgage dollars in less amounts to Black and Latinos than they did to white communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that home ownership is a way to, is a path to securing some level of economic stability and wealth. And so, there are systems in place that sort of bar us from that. So a lot of the work that I've done, and that the work that the foundation that I work at now supports, is supporting projects, supporting community organizing, supporting advocacy that is working towards undoing those systems of inequities that have been in place for really decades. And so education is one of those, right? So the education not being accessible to communities of color, and particularly to working class and lower socioeconomic students, or students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, the student loan debt issue, which is crippling, right? And so you graduate with a degree, hoping that that degree is going to help you obtain a certain salary and to start moving up, right, on the economic scale, but you're also saddled with tremendous amount of student debt, right? So there's all these little systemic issues that are in place that really impact our people, and particularly, right, even more so if you're undocumented, if you are living, if you will, in the margins of society. And so a lot of the work that we've been focusing on is, one, bringing attention to those inequities. Sorry, my dog likes to sit on my lap
Yes.
all the time. So you have a visitor on
I'm glad he is.
the webinar today. Highlighting those inequities, drawing attention to those inequities, but also reminding people that racism is at play. Because I think what often has happened is that, particularly for Black and Latino communities, it's the way it's been explained, it's like we're at fault, like we're not motivated enough, we're not this enough, we're not that enough. That's not true, right? There are barriers that have been put in place on purpose to bar us from many of those areas, so that, one, we can achieve sort of those economic levers of success.
Yeah. One of the other things that we're also finding is the inequities in the distribution of wealth, which is also resulting in inequities in education. So
Yes.
we can look at our city, and just based on where our students live, we can tell them how well or lack of preparedness they will have. It's not because of
Right.
their lack of intelligence, but just because of the lack of resources that are provided to colleges. And I think to not only colleges, but also schools, elementary schools. So we
Yep.
have Latinos that are coming from underfunded neighborhoods that are arriving at college that are underprepared, not because of lack of intelligence or lack of effort, but lack of resources that were provided to those elementary schools. And I think that you're
Absolutely.
also alluding to that's
Absolutely.
also inequities that are happening.
A lack of access. If I think about what I am able to give my son now, based off of my knowledge, but also based off of my income versus what I received, my son just took his PSAT scores. He's a junior in high school. We're going to look to see what he did well in and what he didn't do well in, and immediately get him a tutor. Like those little things that we don't think about, right? That actually then, right, will help him get a higher score, which then will
Yes.
help him get into, like all those little things that often either we couldn't afford, or we just didn't know about, or didn't have access to, that we know that white wealthier families have access to. So it's not, to your point, it's not about that we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the skill sets, it's, or that we don't have the internal knowledge and the skill sets, but it's more about the access. And how do
Sure.
we, I think what I'm very passionate about is how do we make the playing field level for everybody, as opposed to this idea that just because you have money and resources, that then you should have more access to more things. And I don't believe in that. I believe that all students should have the same access to everything, versus just because if your family has more money that you should have access to things.
Right. And Michelle, the other thing that was disturbing to me about talking about equality is that when the pandemic came around and we started teaching online, we recognized that there are deserts, internet deserts in our city.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing that I realized was that even though our students pay the same amount for the internet services in influent areas compared to other areas that did not have, let me try to rephrase it. The students pay the same amount of money for the internet service, but did not get the same level of quality of services. And that was in part because in some of the Latino areas or African American areas, the companies have not invested in those areas. As a result, they're not able to provide us with the service that we are paying for.
Yep.
So how do we address this, Michelle? I know that you've been an advocate for equity and you've been an activist for so long. How do we start approaching
Yeah, I
this?
mean that's an issue that many community-based organizations are starting to take up around internet and quality of internet services. I moved from Logan Square to the far south side about 3 years ago, and the first thing we noticed right away were the quality of services on the far south side. Everything from for example, our street didn't get plowed at all during the snowstorm. Where when we used to live in Logan Square, it would have gotten plowed, and it was because Logan Square was becoming gentrified by the time we moved, right? Our internet services go out all of the time here on the south side versus when we used to live in Logan Square. So what became very glaring during the pandemic that you're pointing to was how much internet services have become almost become a right, not a luxury, right? Because of how digital our world has become, obviously because school is now remote and people are doing everything virtually, because now even access to information, you need the internet to be able to access information. Many community-based organizations, and particularly in Black and Latino communities, have been advocating to the city and to Comcast for a more equitable distribution of internet, more affordable distribution of internet, and to the point you raised, the quality of the internet services, that it's not enough to bring internet into communities of color if the quality of the service is crappy, right? That the quality of the services should be done just as well as it's done in North Side communities or in other communities. So I know that there's a very active group of community organizers that have been working on that since the start of the pandemic. And particularly when all of these stories, of Latino students sitting outside in parking lots where there was, public internet so they could do their homework, or using hotspots. There's been a lot of movement now around how internet can become essentially a utility and a right versus a luxury that you have to, pay an enormous amount for.
Yes, we have spoken about the technology divide, and I think that this pandemic has shown us, and even has further widened the gap.
Yeah.
Because it really breaks my heart to hear of students that are sitting outside of a Starbucks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that they can get that signal.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
There's my son and I, we're both very sarcastic and sometimes can get kind of cynical. There are these Comcast commercials now where they're like promoting how they're putting free internet in community centers. That's okay, that's great. Yeah. But what about putting it in the homes so the kids don't have to leave right their houses to go to the community center to do work? And so I think what we've been fighting for is that the services, the access, the quality of life that a middle class or an upper middle class white family has, everyone should have that, right? Everyone should have internet in their homes. Everyone should have water in their homes without fear of their water being shut off, right? Everyone should have access to quality education, access to quality health care. So, it's still, I think, shocking to me that even though 2021 just started, that's still a conversation that people think that you should only have those things if you can afford them. And if you can't afford them, then, oh well.
Too bad.
Too bad, right?
Yeah. If you don't have, cannot afford health insurance, too bad.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah.
So I know that. What advice would you give our legislators about promoting equity and in the services that we provide and promoting our community?
Yeah, one of the things when we coordinate with legislators and when we support as a foundation the community organizers that work with legislators, one of the things we advocate for is that community voice should always be at the table. I think what often happens is that legislation is written from a viewpoint that does not include the community that's impacted by that legislation. And so then if you're writing it, for example, if the person who's writing I'll just give a stupid example. If a person is writing a homelessness legislation, right, a legislation that deals with, around homelessness, but they've never been homeless, or they've never actually sought the viewpoint and the perspective of someone who has been homeless, then what ends up happening is that often that legislation does not address equity or address equity at a very surface level. So, one of the things that we support and advocate for and support, and try to educate around is how can communities become more empowered to demand that their voice is included and that they are included in the process of when legislation is drafted, written, reviewed, etc., so that it can be as equitable as possible.
Yes, I can see the importance of getting the people that are living it to provide the input and for them to have a voice and to sit around the table as this legislature is being drafted. Because otherwise, like you said, it will address some of the issues, but may not necessarily get to the root of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
then sometimes it creates additional barriers, that it didn't even intend to do. And then it's supposed to address one thing, and then it's created barriers, in a different space. So yeah.
Yeah. As I mentioned, one of the goals that we have is to try to break the cycle of poverty, because we also recognize that approximately 30% of all of the Latino children under the age of 18 live in poverty. And then what's also very shocking to me and disappointing is another 30% of all the adults incarcerated today, guess what? They're Latinos. The other 30% are African Americans.
Yep.
So how do we start, dealing with such a massive issue? I know that you've been an advocate for equity and fighting for the less fortunate and all these issues in our society, and I admire you for it. And so, what can we do?
Yeah. I think one is for those that are attending this lecture on the GoTo webinar to really think about what are the community-based organizations in their communities. Chicago is incredibly fortunate to have a really rich organizing community here. In fact, Chicago, I would argue, has one of the best organizing sectors in the country. And so pretty much almost every community in Chicago has nonprofits that are dedicated to organizing around issues, to advocating around issues. And so I encourage, for the participants on the call today to think about what is that organization in your community that you could potentially become involved with, because they are the ones that are advocating to elected officials. Also, getting involved in advocating to your elected official is huge. I think we make the mistake of focusing a lot on our federal government, which is important, but we get very obsessed sometimes with our federal government when it's actually local government that makes a lot of difference, right? And knowing who your state representative is, and knowing who your congressman is, and knowing who your alderman is exceedingly important, right, to advocating around the issues that impact Latinos directly. But getting involved, I think, is a big way. I think what we've seen often is folks are scared to become involved with organizing and advocacy, or they feel like it's too much or too complicated or that's too political. And unfortunately, we are not going to see changes in these inequitable system unless more and more people are demanding for those changes. So if it's a small percentage of people that are, you know, being seen as complaining, then the systems aren't going to change. It's going to take a tremendous amount of all of us to be able to really advocate to be able to change those systems. And I would also, I'm a big proponent of solidarity work, right? Many, not all, but much of the same things that impact us also impact the Black community, right? High incarceration rates, police brutality, gaps in economic, right, disparity, gaps in academic achievement, all of which have to do, right, with systemic institutionalized racism and systemic racism. And so how can we also work with and align with Black advocates and Black community Black community organizers so that we're moving as a group, right, to then advocate against these issues.
Yeah. You know, the other thing that I think that you were alluding to is also the lack of our participation in, we don't vote. Not enough of us vote anyway. Do you, why do you think that that is the case, that not enough of us, not enough Latinos vote? As a result, we are not electing we are allowing others to elect our representatives, our elected officials.
Well, it's a little bit of a catch-22, and what I mean by that is, right, elected officials want to appeal and speak to those that they know are going to vote for them, right? I think that part of the reason why there are low voter turnout rates in the Latino community is because many elected officials don't speak to us. They don't speak to the issues that we care about. They don't speak to the issues that impact our lives every single day. And yet, though, those elected officials won't do that if we're not turning out to vote, right? So part of it, again, is how do we become educated on our local elected offices, what they're responsible for, what they should be doing for us and for our community. I think we forget that they are essentially supposed to be working for us, right? And we should not feel bad, if you will, about advocating, right, for the quality of our neighborhoods and the quality of our lives. And so how can we do that to, one, push the issues that we're passionate about in regards to the Latino community, but also to make sure that we're turning people out to vote, right? That we're voting in people who have the best interests of our communities in place. And I think that is just something that I think has been happening slowly, and on top of it, you know, so many barriers that exist to voting doesn't help either, right?
No, it doesn't.
So there's, so many, you know, I think it's particularly, I think for our communities, so many of them, they're work in places where their bosses won't let them take time off to vote or won't let them take the day off to vote. And so there's a tremendous amount of barriers in place as well that also prevent our communities from voting. So again, many of the organizations that we support through the foundation do a lot of advocacy around voting access and removal of voting barriers to increase, right, the voting patterns in communities of color.
Yes, you know, the pandemic has shown also has highlighted many of the other inequities that exist in our community. It should have not been a surprise to me that this pandemic was going to impact so many Latinos and so many African Americans, as it did. The majority of the deaths are Latinos and African Americans. And once again, it goes to the lack of resources and inequities that our community are being provided with.
I challenge I think we're told often that there's a lack of resources. I think there are resources. There's just a lack of will on how to allocate those resources, and also a lack of will when it comes to pushing more resources out when they're needed. I think the city of Chicago has the money if it wants to have the money. I think it chooses to be broke in certain areas and to constantly say that we don't have resources, or the budget has a deficit, or whatever the case may be. One of the things that has been, it wasn't surprising, but it was a shock, right? I think even though I knew, right, that our community has lack to healthcare, access to healthcare, has a tendency to have pre-existing medical conditions, has all of those things, I was still shocked when I saw the infection rates. And then now the numbers of deaths have surpassed all other communities of color. And so, part of what we're trying to advocate for, particularly in philanthropy, is that philanthropy has to recognize that all of these communities, particularly Black and Latinos, are being impacted. And what we tend to do is we focus on one over the other, right? We either focus on Latino over Black, or Black over Latino, and then all that does is create the infighting between the two communities and the competition between the two communities, as opposed to foundations really releasing more resources so that we're actually elevating both issues instead of making each one compete over one another. So that's one of the things that we've also been kind of advocating for as well in the philanthropic sector.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you another question about equity, and then I would like to open the questions to the audience. But tell me about your views on equity, because, and here's what I'm thinking about. It is not for sufficient to give the same level of resources to all groups, but rather, but tell me what your views on that. I know that this is something that's very dear to you.
Yeah, I mean, equality is where you give the same resources to all groups. Equity is where you really pay attention and you're mindful of the historic inequities that have impacted groups differently, and then you align the resources, right, according to those historic inequities and sort of what's at play and sort of the reality of those communities. So it's one thing that I think is being lost in the conversations around equity. I think we still talk about equity as though it's equality, and that everybody should get the same amounts. We know, right, that in our community has undocumented residents. And so we have to provide resources in a different manner to make sure that we are providing for our undocumented, Chicagoans versus what another community might be dealing with, right? And so, part of equity, and this is where it gets hard, because people want to apply almost like a blanket over everything. They want to apply the same type of practice to everything, and that isn't going to work. And that's just going to continue to create further inequities, right? It takes a lot of work and a lot of thought and a lot of mindfulness and intentionality to focus on every community differently, and to give resources differently, and to include community in that, in how even that resource should be designed. And I think we as a society always want to rush things, and we don't want to do all that. We just want to give the money out or give this out and then let see what happens. And again, that's just not gonna change things.
Yeah, and this gets me to think to one of the comments that you made about involving the homeless in the conversation, if we're going to develop some policy for the homeless. Because here's the thing, if we have people that never been poor, that never seen this inequities in their lives, and they are going to design a legislature for that, they are, people may just want to give the same amount of resources to every person, independent of where they are in the, in our society, and that is not going to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, good.
But it's easier, right? It's easier to write that legislation without involving people.
Sure, give the $600 to every individual, and they'd be happy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then it becomes news, and you get the sound bites, and everybody feels happy. And then at the end of the day, you're like, no, wait a minute, that wasn't good enough, or that didn't solve any issues. And so, yeah, I think that is something, again, like for those students who are on the call, and for those, folks who are affiliated with St. Augustine who are on the call, like, the more I'm a huge advocate for people to get involved in organizing and advocacy, because again, the more voices that are at the table, the more voices that are making the demands, the more that we will be listened to.
Yes, can agree with you more. Rafael is monitoring the questions. Rafael, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, I want to open up to the audience. If they have any questions, they can put it on the chat. They can raise their hand, and then I'll make sure that Michelle and Dr. Gonzalez can answer the question.
Sure. Michelle, one thing that I didn't ask you, so where you were raised in most of your life in New York, or what age did you
No,
come to?
I was born in New York, in Yonkers, New York, and then we moved to different military bases.
Okay.
And then I went to high school in Indianapolis, Indiana, and then in 1993 moved to Chicago to attend DePaul University. So I've been living in Chicago since 1993.
But your parents are originally from Puerto Rico?
Yes. Oh. Yes, they are.
All right, Michelle, we have a couple of questions here from the audience. The first one is, how have your professional journey and current position as a CEO of a major organization impact your personal life?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So when you become a CEO, and I think Dr. Gonzalez can probably speak to this as well, when you become the leader of a major institution or major organization, you do make some compromises when it comes to your personal life. I will not sit here and tell all of you that I work a 40-hour week and I have my weekends off. I don't. I work evenings, I work weekends, and part of it is I am so passionate about the organization that I lead. Putting in the extra hours is not, for me, a big deal. But that was something when I took my first CEO position at Mikvah Challenge 6 years ago. Before I transitioned to the foundation, I had a conversation with my family about what it would mean for me to take the job, what it would mean for our time as a family, what it would mean for some of the roles and duties in the house, like cleaning and dishes. And I will say what's been interesting about the pandemic, because we have been lucky enough to work from home since almost a year now, since March 2020. When the pandemic happened, I realized it was the first time in 5 years I was eating dinner with my family. Because I was out at events in the evenings and doing networking and things like that. So for me, the pandemic has really forced me to pay attention to my own boundaries and to what I was doing professionally to try to advance my career, sometimes in sacrificing my time with my family, that I'm not sure I want to go back to post-pandemic. I want to figure out a better balance than I think I have for the last 6 years.
Interesting.
We have another question, Michelle. What message do you have for all the students who are the first generation to college? And I think you already answered that, and the other one is, how would you like to be remembered?
So my advice for all of you first generation college students who are near and dear to my heart, because I know what you're going through, stick with it. You will have moments where you will doubt sorry, my dogs are going nuts in the background. You will doubt your ability. You will doubt your skill sets. You will doubt if these spaces are right for you. I promise you that they are. I promise that the world needs you. It needs your perspective. It needs your insight. It needs your talent. It needs your lived experience, because that is the way we are going to get to an equitable and inclusive United States. As long as the United States, if those that are in decision-making positions and in positions of power and authority continue to be white and male and from economic means, then our country will not change. And I think that the more you sticking with it, getting that college degree, really pushes more narrative, right, that will change this country for the better and for the future generations. And what do I want to be remembered for? I'm really passionate about mentoring, particularly young women of color in leadership positions. I think being a woman of color in a leadership position is very, very hard, because we bring to the table a different set of leadership skills that often is not honored or validated. And we are often told that leadership is not right, or does not look right in the spaces that we're in. And it took me a long time to realize that my type of leadership and my leadership style was the right leadership style, and it didn't have to look like others that have been my supervisors in the past. And so I want to be hopefully remembered for always being accessible, always being open, always being one that was willing to mentor and champion people to the next level of their career or their life. And I hope to be remembered as a leader who really worked very hard to create equitable workplaces, particularly workplaces that center women and women of color.
Thank you, Michelle. We have another question. The Latino community's class structure, as most communities are, would you agree that those of us who have made it have a responsibility to mentor our young people primarily?
Yes, I do. I think that the more, I think what's been challenging, particularly if you're a first generation college graduate, I'm sure people on the call have heard the saying, you can't be it if you can't see it. Sorry, this is the challenge of working from home. You have pets who get on your lap, you have a pressure cooker going off in the kitchen. And so you can't be things if you can't see it, right? You can't think of yourself as a CEO if you've never seen someone who looks like you and who came from your background in a CEO position. And so I do think that we do have a responsibility to mentor younger professionals and younger individuals, because if we don't, how can they see that their path, that we potentially may had a path to leadership that resonates with them, right? And I think that that's what made it, and I'm sure Dr. Gonzalez can agree too. I think when we were both coming up in our career, we probably saw very few people who looked like us and who had our lived experience in the positions that we're in, which really makes you then question, are those spaces again right for me? Should I even be in those spaces? So the more that I think we can mentor and help our young people to access information, to be able to access opportunities, but also to understand that leadership is not point A to point B, that it's a zigzag, and things will happen, and life will happen, and all of that is okay, and you can still aspire to certain positions, I think is very important to the overall success of our communities.
Thank you, Michelle. We have another question. We have several questions, so I'm going to ask, people that if we don't get to answer all of them, just, forgive us because we have limited time. Is it vital that language minority students embrace their native languages? How can we get this message out to families?
So that's an interesting question posed to someone who is not fluent in Spanish. So I think we have to be really mindful of what it is to be raised in this country, particularly if you're first generation US born. We're sent messages all of the time that speaking Spanish is still not okay, right? When I grew up, I had a kindergarten teacher who told my parents to stop speaking Spanish to me because they were confusing me. I was bilingual. And my parents, because they were so worried about me not being able to acclimate to, not doing well in school, they stopped speaking Spanish to me. And so my brother and my sister and I were raised, speaking very limited Spanish. And now as a 45-year-old, I'm not fluent. My son's not fluent, right? And it's something that, honestly, I carry with all the time, that I'm not able to speak my native tongue. So I think we have to, one, recognize that there are barriers that are intentionally created to prevent students from speaking Spanish, or to convince them that Spanish is still not a worthy language to speak or to be bilingual. So that's one aspect of it. And I think another aspect of it, and so I'm just going to say this from my experience, part of the reason why I hate speaking Spanish is that my family used to make fun of my accent. So I think even in our own families and in our own culture, we do kind of send messages to young people who are learning Spanish as a second language and trying, that the Spanish may not sound good enough, right? And so that creates a complex within us where then we're like, whoop, we're not going to speak Spanish. So, which is something I have a goal, you know, in the next couple of years to begin practicing my Spanish and speaking Spanish. But I will tell you, I'm terrified. I'm terrified of speaking Spanish in public. I'm terrified of people hearing my accent. I'm terrified of making a mistake. And so I've been asked to speak in Spanish and I always refuse and won't do it. Like you have to be, I will only speak Spanish, and my husband's always surprised when I do speak Spanish. If someone needs my help and they only speak Spanish, that's when I'll speak Spanish. So I think families have to consider the messages that they're sending to younger people. And then we also have to think about the larger systemic issues that are at play that really create barriers towards acquisition of the Spanish language in the United States.
Thank you, Michelle. What is like to go from grant seeker to grant maker?
Yeah, so I used to be a fundraiser and I used to have to beg foundations for money, and now I lead a foundation that gives money out. So it's been really interesting, the switch from a grant seeker to a grant maker. Honestly, I think that more folks who used to be grant seekers should become staff at foundations and should lead foundations, because we bring a lens in where we understand what it means to fundraise. We understand all the barriers that were put in place to fundraising. We understand sort of what the fundraising industrial complex has done to the nonprofit sector. And so I've been able to bring that lens into the Woods Fund. We're redoing all of our grant making procedures, trying to lessen the barriers to grant seekers and trying to make things as simple as possible. And I think that I would not have brought that in if I didn't have the experience of being a grant seeker. But I will say it's weird. It's weird to have money to give out. It's also, you know, you're always trying to think about how to give funds out in the most impactful way possible and in a way that will help communities as much as possible. So it's an ongoing process that has been really interesting for me now that I'm on this side of the table.
Michelle, what do you think about the lack of diversity in nonprofits and many other institutions, specifically regarding Afro-Latinx, Latinx?
Yeah. And I think, so there are still, so I'll use myself as an example. I'm one of 2 Latinas who run a foundation in the city of Chicago. So there still are not that many of us who are in positions of authority and positions of power. There are still not that many of us who inhabit the CEO seat or the executive director seat or even the executive leadership seat. So one of the things that we have been advocating for as a foundation as we look at racial equity is also looking at those that we give funding to ensure that they have diversity, not in the frontline staff, because many nonprofits will have a lot of diversity in their programmatic and frontline staff. And then when you go up the chart, you start to see that those that sit in the decision-making and authority seats tend to be white. And so we really are driving the point home with those that receive funding from us, that in order for them to continue to receive funding from us, we need to see diversification at their executive level, at their executive director level, and on their boards. And again, that is a part of racial equity, demanding, right, that people of color are sitting in seats of authority and of power and of decision-making, not that we are the ones who are the ones delivering the services, if you will, but that we're making the decisions. And so that's one thing that we've been trying to do as a foundation to move that diversity issue along.
Michelle, what advice do you have for staff faculty whose colleagues do not have equitable practices in the classroom settings? It's so frustrating. How can we manage to push through?
Yeah, so I would say it would start with like the leaders, so Dr. Gonzalez, right, making sure that that's getting pushed down. I would say that hopefully, right, that's a part of performance reviews, that's a part of, you know, how can you hold people accountable to equitable practices in the classroom? And I think for a long time, that was not something we held people accountable to, but now we're starting to realize as a society that if equitable practices are not happening in the classroom, then you start to see a direct correlation between that and even the success of students, right? If the students are not treated equitably, you see that in their success and in the outcomes of their success. So, you know, I would advocate for how can those measures of equitable practices be incorporated into some sort of an accountability process and some sort of performance review process for faculty and for staff, so that they're aware that you actually need to incorporate this. This isn't something we're just asking you to do just to do it, but that it aligns with the values of St. Augustine or whatever other university or college that the staff and faculty are at.
Michelle, what is the best way, or where do you start to convey the power that we have as a people in our society or communities we live in? How can we educate the individuals in the political sphere so they can better understand the power of a vote in this country?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to get involved with their local, you know, community organizers and their local advocates. I would encourage folks to get involved with any Get Out the Vote initiatives that happen. Education, you know, I think we still rely too much as a city and as a country on TV and internet to educate people, but really old-fashioned door knocking and old-fashioned phone banking, which I know has been hard to do in a pandemic, is the way, particularly I think in our communities, to educate folks on the importance of voting, the importance of elected officials, of holding elected officials accountable, and also some of the best groups that I've seen actually go with people to do that advocating, right, and not let individuals do it on their own, because it can be scary. So I would just encourage folks on the call again to please, you know, you can check our website at Woods Fund Chicago. We have a list of our grantees, of who we support. Again, you know, Chicago is rich with an organizing sector and an advocacy sector that really holds its elected officials accountable, and figuring out a way to get involved in some of those with some of those organizations.
Perfect. Thank you. One more, and I think we have enough for one more. While I agree that we must retain and nurture our heritage and our language, we must learn English and speak it and write it correctly if we wish to achieve higher goals. Your thoughts on that?
I would say yes, unfortunately, right? Because we still live in a country and in a society that if you do not learn the language and learn how to write it correctly, then you are seen as less than. So for me, unfortunately, right, we still have to do a measure of code switching, and we still have to do a measure of adopting, making sure that we're speaking the language, we're writing it correctly, et cetera, because if not, then we're not viewed as competent individuals. You know, a lot of the groups that we work with are challenging that, and are challenging the notion of what does it mean for, you know, again, because we live in a country that on the surface level, if you don't look like, speak like, write like everyone else, then you're seen as less than. And so part of the question is, while I, in some respects, understand the question, because I had to do that, many of us who are in successful positions have had to do that. One of the things I encourage people to do is also to challenge that, right? Just because that is the way it has been for so many years and what has been expected of us does not mean that it's right. It does not mean that because someone does not speak English well or does not write English well, that they should be denied access to a job or to a quality of life. We should still be, again, if this is the country that markets itself as the country of immigrants, which is how we used to be marketed pre-Trump, shouldn't this then be a country that is welcoming to folks who are still learning to master the language? And shouldn't we honor everyone who has a second, third language, who is figuring out how to write in a new language and still create space for that flexibility?
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. On behalf of St. Augustine College, I want to thank you for sharing your life story. Thank you for being an advocate for us. Thank you for standing for equity. And thank you for doing all the things that nobody else is doing. So know that at St. Augustine, you have a home. And I hope as soon as this pandemic's over, you will visit us and motivate the many students that we have. So once again, thank you. And Take care of yourself
Thank
and
you.
stay safe.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.